Okay, so welcome to section 1.1, fallacies in common language. Common language. So please take notes while I lecture. That's the easiest way to learn, is to actually write along with me. So fallacies in common language. Pardon me, so definition. Okay, so a fallacy in logic. So a fallacy, that's what we're defining. So a fallacy in logic is a failure in reasoning. So in logic is a failure in reasoning. Failure in reasoning. Reasoning. Which renders an argument valid. So, i.e., your reasoning, which you think makes your argument valid, is invalid. So, which renders an argument valid. An argument valid. Okay, so that is another way of saying this, i.e., that is a misleading argument. Pardon me. A misleading argument. My goodness. Argument. Okay, so types of fallacies include. So types of fallacies. Now, section 1.1 is pretty much a list of definitions. So it might seem grueling, but we will get through this. So the first type of fallacy is an ad hominem. So towards hominem, the human, right? We're going to attack the human or attack the person who's making the argument. So this fallacy attacks the person making the argument. So attacks the person making the argument. The argument. While failing to address the argument itself, right? So while failing to address the argument itself. The argument itself. So instead of arguing the actual point being made, you start to attack the person making the argument. So it's kind of a way to derail the argument, and it's a fallacy. So for example, if one person says the sky is blue, the response could be, you're a redhead. So I don't believe what you have to say. So I don't believe you. The sky isn't blue. So we're refuting the argument based on the fact that you're a redhead. So this is an ad hominem attack. So that's the ad hominem. I'm attacking this person's hair color to try and win an argument, which makes no sense, right? It's an invalid argument. It's a fallacy. Another example would be, say 1 + 1 is 2. 1 + 1 is 2. And the response would be something like, you're not smart enough to do math. Not smart enough to count. 1 plus 1 isn't 2. Isn't 2. And this is ironic because the person saying this, of course, is incorrect. So they're not smart enough to count, right? But they're attacking the person versus attacking the argument. So you're not smart enough. This is an ad hominem. This is attacking the person, right? Ad hominem. It's a false. It's a fallacy, right? This is not an argument. This is just someone being petty. Okay, so another type of fallacious argument would be what's called an appeal to ignorance. So appeal to ignorance. Okay, and this fallacy is when you say if something hasn't been proven false, it must be true. Okay, so assumes what hasn't been proven false. What hasn't been proven false must be true. Must therefore be true. And that's a false argument. Therefore be true. And of course, that's not necessarily the case. So for example, an example of this would be no one has shown aliens exist. Therefore they don't. And no matter what you think, whether or not aliens exist, no one can say, right? Because no one has shown they do exist, and no one has shown they don't exist. We can't conclude that they don't just because we haven't seen one, right? So, no one has shown aliens exist. This is a appeal to ignorance. The ignorance being our ignorance of whether or not aliens exist. That's what the ignorance is. We don't know. So appeal to ignorance. So based on our ignorance, can we conclude that they don't? No, because we're ignorant of the fact. Okay, another one would be, for example, Bigfoot, right? So no one has proven, or no one has disproven the existence of Bigfoot. The THE. The existence of Bigfoot. So therefore, he exists. Therefore, he, she exists. He exists. Okay, so based on our ignorance of the non-existence of Bigfoot, we're going to say that he does exist. Well, we don't know either way, right? So this is the appeal to ignorance. We are ignorant either way. We do not know. Therefore, we cannot conclude anything. That's a fallacious argument. Okay, the next type of fallacy would be an appeal to authority. So appeal to authority. So just because someone in a white lab coat says something, do we believe it? Well, sometimes we do, right? But it's a false argument. So using the authority, so uses the authority of the person speaking or arguing, so the authority of the person speaking, to validate an argument. An argument. It's like assuming that a politician says it, therefore it must be true. And of course, we all know about politicians and their lips moving. Okay, so for example, Joe Rogan says that veganism isn't healthy. So Joe Rogan says that veganism isn't healthy. Okay, so who is the authority here? So it would be Joe Rogan. So the appeal to authority here is the authority of Joe Rogan. But does he really have authority to be a nutritionist? Well, we have to ask ourselves that. So the Pope says, God exists. Therefore, he does. Now, does the fact that the Pope needs to say God exists mean that he does or doesn't? Well, that's not for me to say, but the appeal to the authority of the Pope is a fallacious argument. Okay? It's usually the humble that know that thing. Okay, so another fallacy would be the appeal to consequence. So the appeal to consequence. So basically, this is saying depending on the outcome, you argue your... Okay, so how do I want to say this? So this fallacy uses the outcome, either good or bad, to validate an argument. Validate an argument. Okay, so an example of this would be, say, something like, for example, say, I've never had any issues with vaping. Therefore, vaping is safe. Therefore, vaping is safe. So what is the consequence here? The consequence here is I've never had any issues with vaping, right? So that's a consequence. Appeal to consequence. But that's only one person, right? And it's not long term. So this is a false argument. You can't just take one person's conclusion as a valid form of argument. So one of my students gave me this next example, and it is marijuana is legal. Is legal, and note spelling is not my strong suit, so forgive me if it's spelled incorrectly. So therefore, it must be good for you. It must be good for you. So this is actually twofold as far as why this is a fallacious argument. Okay. Well, if it's legal, that's an authority, right? Those making the laws are an authority. So we could also say it's an appeal. It's an appeal to authority. But the consequence of it being legal makes us say it must be good for you. Well, that's a fake argument, a false argument. So this is the appeal to consequence. Okay, on to our next. Like I said, this section is a lot of definitions, but we'll get through it. Okay, so the next fake or false argument will be what's known as a false dilemma. So a false dilemma. And this is when you're given an either or scenario when multiple choices exist. So this type of fallacy gives an either or scenario when multiple, or when in actuality, multiple options exist. Okay, so a classic example of this would be you can either vote Republican or Democrat, right? So you can either vote Republican or Democrat. Well, the fallacy here is there's multiple parties. There's a Green Party, there's a Libertarian Party, there's the Anarchist Party. Which is kind of silly because if you don't want a government, why is there a party? Okay, so this is the either or false dilemma, right? There's really multiple parties, so false dilemma. But we're usually only given two, and that's your government lying to you, or at least their mouthpieces in the media. Okay, so another false dilemma would be you're either with us. So you're either with us or against us. So this assumes that in life there's no gray areas, which is, only true if you're a computer. So false dilemma. There's always gray areas in real life. Okay? You can be on the fence. You can choose to not choose a side, like Switzerland. Okay, so the next fallacy would be a post hoc, ergo propter hoc. So post hoc argument. So in Latin, this is post hoc, ergo propter hoc, ergo propter hoc. Okay, so in translation, this means, i.e., that is, it est. So after this, therefore, because of this, post, after, hoc, this, ergo, therefore, because of, propter, or due to, because of this. Okay, so what does this mean? This uses events in sequence to prove causality. So this uses events in sequence to prove, and I'll use that term loosely because this is a fallacy, to prove causality. So one thing caused the next to happen. Okay, so what's an example of this? So for example, so every time the sun rises, the rooster crows. Oops, oh my goodness, I'm using the wrong color. Hold on. Need to use this color. Okay, so for example, so every time the sun rises, every time the sun rises, the rooster crows. The rooster crows. Okay, so hence the sun rises because the rooster crows. So hence the sun rises because the rooster crows. Sun rises because the rooster crows. Now clearly this is a fallacy, right? But this is something that happens in sequence. What's happening in sequence? Well, the sun rises and then the rooster crows, right? The sun rises and the rooster crows, so we're assuming that the sun rises because the rooster crows, right? So this is the post hoc. Just because things happen in sequence does not indicate that the sun rises because the rooster is crowing, right? However, I would argue the converse. The rooster does crow because the sun is rising. Okay, so now the next type of argument, or sorry, not argument, fallacy rather, is called a straw man argument. And you'll see this a lot in politics. And this is misrepresenting an argument in order to more easily dismantle it. So misrepresenting an argument so to more easily dismantle it, so i.e. that is, id est gaslighting, intentionally misrepresenting what the other person is trying to argue. So for example, an example of this would be, so say Greenpeace doesn't care about the well-being of people in coal mining towns, something like this. So Greenpeace doesn't care about the well-being of people in coal mining towns. Okay, so the argument here is that because Greenpeace might be concerned about the environment, that somehow that equates to them not being concerned about the people. Well, that's a false argument. Okay, so this is a straw man argument. So this whole first statement, the well-being of people, wherever they may be. So this is a straw man argument. And it's a disingenuous argument, right? Okay, so the last type of fallacy I'm going to introduce here will be that correlation implies causation. So just because two things are correlated does not mean that one caused the other. So correlation implies causation. This is a fallacy. Okay. So this assumes that if two events are related, then one caused the other. So it assumes that if two events, and remember that word events, so two events are related, then one caused the other. Okay, so this is a fallacy. And it's the last fallacy I'll deal with in this section, so I will see you guys in section 1.2.